welcome to Observations, Moments in Design History. My name is Donna McComb and I'm the Assistant Director of Curatorial and Audience Engagement here at the NGV. I would like to begin by acknowledging the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people as the traditional owners of the land on which the NGV stands and from where I am speaking with you today. I pay my respects to their elders past and present and to Aboriginal elders of other communities who may be joining us today. The NGV has a significant collection of historical decorative arts and design, and using our collection as a vehicle, in this series we are excited to delve into the movements, materials and manufacturers that have shaped global design across 4 centuries. It is wonderful to welcome you all today for Design in the Early Modern Period, the first session in our 2023 Observations Seminar Series. In our seminar today, we will explore the materials and technologies that have shaped global design in times of change, especially in the early modern period. We will look at decorative arts of the 17th and 18th centuries, including materials and technical innovations, as well as the rise of trade between Asia and Europe, which led to an influx of luxury goods arriving in Europe. We look at the profound developments in design, decoration and manufacture of objects that occurred as a result. We will hear from experts from all over the world about topics including Sèvres Porcelain Factory and biscuit porcelain sculpture, 18th century furniture design with its use of locks and secret drawers, and the role of design histories in Korea. We are thrilled you could join us for what we know will be an enlightening and informative series of presentations today. We will now begin our first presentation. I hope you enjoyed today's seminar and thank you for joining us.
Good morning and welcome everyone. My name is Amanda Dunsmore and I'm Senior Curator of International Decorative Arts and Antiquities at the National Gallery Victoria. Wonderful to see you all here today for Design in the Early Modern Period, the first of our seminar series in Observations, Moments in Design History. I'm delighted to introduce our first speaker for today's seminar, Elizabeth Bogdan. Elizabeth is a specialist in decorative arts and design and has taught in tertiary institutions for the past 30 years, initially at Cardiff Institute of Art and Design and Southampton Solent University, and for the past 20 years at Sotheby's Institute of Art in London, where she is currently faculty and subject leader for the MA in Fine and Decorative Art and Design. Her areas of research and teaching range from the 18th century to 20th century European and American design, decorative arts, and architectural history. She contributes to courses at the V&A, she speaks regularly to specialist societies, and has published in numerous journals, including the Journal of Design History and the Decorative Arts Society. This morning, Elizabeth will be presenting a context-setting overview, looking at the social context of objects and materials and technological innovation in the 17th and 18th centuries. Her focus will be on ceramics, in particular the Wedgwood manufacture in England and the rise of the porcelain industry in Europe. It's a pleasure to have you deliver our first presentation for the series, Elizabeth, and we warmly welcome you.
Many thanks for the introduction, Amanda, and it is my pleasure to give this lecture as part of your first section of the National Gallery's History of Design series. It's important to preface a discussion of Wedgwood by considering 17th and early 18th century ceramic manufacture, because knowledge of both its production and consumption contextualize the production and consumption of Wedgwood's later 18th century manufactured objects. There are economic, political, and cultural factors that affected both porcelain and non-porcelain wares throughout the 18th century and across countries, and thus I will begin by considering the positioning of different ceramic bodies and their aesthetics as a foundation for the context of Wedgwood's unique technical, aesthetic, and marketing genius. I have included a good number of objects from the National Gallery's collection, but also I note in my presentation objects from other collections, notably the Wallace collection and the V&A in London. When we think of Wedgwood, the great father of the Industrial Revolution, we think of sophisticated products that were at the height of fashion and technological advance, in particular of encaustic ware and jasperware. These non-porous earthenwares were made from mixing clay with a fusible stone such as feldspar and fired at a high temperature, first with a material he called black basalt, fashioning vases, candlesticks, figures, busts, cameos, intaglios and seals, and refining existing Staffordshire knowledge by adding greater quantities of natural ochreous compounds or of crude iron rust. This lecture's focus on Wedgwood, when we get to him, will be principally on his creamware, his first innovation and the bedrock of his success. His other earthenware innovations propelled him further towards fashionable acclaim and financial advantage, but it was his commitment to an evolving non-porcelain ware and his steadfast belief in its relative and reaching merits in the face of both European and English porcelain competition that distinguished him as both manufacturer and designer. So to begin, the history of earthenware in the post-Renaissance modern period of decorative art history does not begin in the 18th century or even the 17th century. Before the early 18th century, Europeans had not acquired the knowledge of how to produce a Far East porcelain equivalent, though it was guardedly collected and revered. Aside from a brief period of Florentine artificial porcelain experimentation by the Medici family towards the end of the 16th century, the accepted excellence of European ceramic making was articulated first through tin-glazed earthenware, or maiolica in Italy, and then by the French Huguenot Bernard Palissy's molded and lead-glazed earthenware, rustic ware, typically highly decorated, large oval platters featuring small animals and reptiles in relief amongst vegetation. Nearly 100 years later, the next examples of European earthenware innovative technique and aesthetics emerged to signify the beginnings of the true modern period, this time in the Netherlands. Tin-glazed Dutch Delft, an evolved product of 16th century technologies, but also, of course, from the exposure to the Far East via Holland's prodigious trade with China, Japan, and Korea via the East India companies. Delft is characterized by its use of a glassy lead glaze, opacified with the addition of oxide or the ashes of tin. After a once-fired body has been dipped into a mixture or slurry of water and ground glazed material, this biscuited body soaks up the water, leaving a glaze deposit on its surface. It is then ready to be decorated with a variety of high temperature tolerant metallic pigments, cobalt for blue, manganese for purple, copper for green, antimony for yellow, and iron for a brick red. When subsequently firing in the glazing or glossed kiln, the heat fuses the glaze and develops the metallic oxide pigments. Even more crucially, the kiln heat allows for a milky white canvas. This was as close as an approximation to East Asian porcelains in aesthetics as the Dutch might achieve. The abundance of trade ware allowed for keen imitation for their own earthenware achievement, and which was so central to Dutch Old Master painting still lives. By the end of the 17th century, noble collections across Europe counted not only Far East imported porcelains, but also Dutch tin-glazed earthenware facsimiles for distinguished porcelain cabinets. Here in this slide, more examples of Dutch Delft, where innovation is seen beyond the materials and techniques of the evolved tin-glazed and oxide decorative earthenware sophistication. We have vases, apothecary jars, and on the left, a unique Dutch innovation, the pyramidal flower vase or statuary. In France, the Delft style was appreciated. However, it differed decoratively in that the influence from China was less strong. Certainly, Eastern-influenced ornament was employed, but in addition to direct copying from the Chinese, French tin-glazed earthenware or faience producers of the late 17th century attempted to create a characteristic French style. From the period of about 1630 to 1660, French faience was more in keeping with the classical and symmetrical architectural and furniture forms of the period than with imitative Near or Far East inspiration. Technically, French faience producers were indebted to the tin-glazed advancement at Delft. This manufacturing knowledge, however, was applied via detailed motifs with black and red monochrome painting that generally reflected the lavish and courtly taste of Versailles. The Rouen factory was synonymous with the brilliant late Baroque Louis XIV style. From the province of Normandy, the factory received special license to manufacture faience as early as 1644, and though you can see on the left an even earlier 16th century detail of its production. Its significant feature was the use of the historic style rayonnant, characterized by the sole use of embroidery lines of blue on a white ground, or varied with soft red or ochre yellow detailing. This style incorporated the regular use of triangular motifs directed towards the center of the ware, particularly on plates, in imitation of festoons of draperies known as lambrequins, as employed in period interiors on the borders of bed canopies and in window recesses. Louis XIV's edict of 1689 that ordered all vessels of gold and silver to be melted down to help offset the ruinous cost of his wars was repeated in 1709, forcing wealthy and aristocratic consumers to look towards ceramics for luxury banqueting objects, thus enabling faience production to increase. Centers multiplied, and products became more varied and individual. Rouen was notable for, as mentioned, the great size of its wares and for its varied and inventive table accoutrements, from ice pails to salt cellars and dredgers for powdered sugar and spices. All this Dutch and French tin-glazed earthenware, technical and aesthetic innovation signaled a high point of European ceramic elegance. This could not be sustained, however, relative to the tour de force of experimentation in Saxony in the early 18th century, under the patronage and forceful directives of its elector, Augustus II, also known as Augustus the Strong. He was a man of extravagant and luxuriant tastes. He was at war with his neighbors for most of his reign. Also, he was a fanatical collector of Far East Asian porcelains and almost bankrupted the country due to his passion. He notably swapped the finest soldiers in his army for a collection of 48 vases. The combined expertise of scientist Ehrenfried Walter von Tschirnhaus, who had visited the Delft kilns in 1701, and the alchemist Johann Friedrich Böttger catapulted Augustus's court into a stratospheric new realm by 1708. Both men were instructed to formulate new materials for Augustus, in Böttger's case, to transmute base metal into gold. This he could not achieve. He did, however, with von Tschirnhaus's contribution, develop through a number of ceramic experiments, first in red stoneware, a very close approximation to white porcelain in the East Asian manner. The inclusion of kaolin rock was the mystery of the arcanum, or the secret, which was fiercely protected. The German porcelains at Meissen of the early 18th century, at their best, are amongst the finest ever made. Their forms were influenced by German metalwork and by the imported porcelains of China and Japan, ranging from Chinese pagoda figures and blanc de chine to Japanese designs and shapes. This combination articulated the unique blend of East Asia aesthetic imitation with late European Baroque form. By the 1730s, ground colors and gilding were introduced, and more European decoration, such as Indianische Blumen and Deutsche Blumen, literally meaning German flowers, naturalistically ensued. In this slide, here we see the superlative modeling work of Johann Joachim Candler, Meissen's greatest modeler. Augustus had let his imagination run riot and commissioned, among a number of large projects, life-size animal figures to reflect the extent of his real animal menagerie. Candler did his best with a material unsuited to the demands made upon it, and we can see on the right with a pair of examples from the National Gallery's collection. For smaller figures, as seen on the left, charming and graceful, these captured the imagination of the aristocracy and quickly supplanted the models in sugar and salt, which previously adorned the tables of the wealthy. It was during the 7-Year War from 1756 to 763, when the factory came under Prussian control, that it lost its preeminent position in Europe. What then of French porcelain production before 1750? Manufacturers or factories hoping to imitate Saxon excellence of material found themselves at a great disadvantage. The precious kaolin rock needed for hard paste manufacture was unknown on French soil, still in the early 18th century, leading to a concentration instead on developing an artificial porcelain paste, one that would approximate the delicacy and whiteness of true porcelain, but that nonetheless might be still attractive enough to compete with Meissen. This artificial material came to be known as soft paste, or pâte tendre, the tender paste, composed by mixing white clay with a ground glass or frit compound and fired at generally much less than the lowest firing temperature needed for the production of hard paste porcelain, that is, at 1250 degrees Celsius. It was costly and difficult to produce. The lower temperature required to fuse the frit with the white clay meant that wares were less stable and more vulnerable in the kiln. Great losses occurred and made large-scale commercial production impossible. Two notable French factories emerged in the first half of the 18th century, the first being Saint-Cloud, the factory held on the estate of the Duke d'Orléans, brother to Louis XIV. This soft paste is renowned for its warmth of tone, for its satiny glaze, and its excellent modeling. Early paint pieces were either unpainted or decorated in underglaze blue, detailed, as you can see here, with the delicate lambrequin employed by similarly by faience producers. Also executed in the Japanese Kakeyamon style after 1730, using brilliant enamel polychromes. Additionally, the factory imitated Meissen blanc de chine, which itself had imitated Chinese Fujian ware. It was promoted and marketed through a shop in Paris, the products marked by a sun and the letters SC, also usually accompanied by a letter T. By the late 1730s, its forms fell under the spell of Rococo fashion, and it had established itself as a recognizable contributor to the European porcelain marketplace. The Chantilly artificial paste factory, supported by the noble ceramic collector, the Prince de Condé, was established on his estate in 1725. The painters at the Chantilly factory did not have to reach far for knowledge of Eastern form and palette. The prince's collection included 2,000 items of porcelain from China and Japan. This prodigious collection ensured that even for the simplest of Chantilly designs, his draftsmen could execute in the Far Eastern taste in a high imitative quality. Unlike the Saint Cloud factory, which used a glass-like holy lead glaze until around 1735, the glaze on Chantilly soft paste porcelain was whitened with tin oxide. This gave it a nearly opaque characteristic, similar to that used for both faience and for Delft. The tin oxide inclusion gave Chantilly's ware a fresh clarity and luster to its enamel painting. We see a typical Blanc de Chine example in the center from the National Gallery's collection. And the highly recognizable mark for the Chantilly factory was the standard curling hunting horn device, painted usually in red or blue, both over and under the glaze. In developing a viable alternative to Chinese and Saxon hard paste porcelain, the French had turned a potentially negative situation into a highly positive one. The development of soft paste provided French manufacturers with a fashionable and elegant foray into the European marketplace, and with it, the impetus for further experimentation and development. This early 18th century soft paste porcelain development provided the framework for France's preeminent porcelain production at Vincennes, later to become Sèvres, enabling France to become by the 1760s the foremost leader in 18th century production, both in fashion and in technical excellence. Patronized now by Louis XV, the importance of manufacturing and marketing a large funded and centrally encouraged French manufacturer from the early 1740s, Vincennes became known for its rich, jewel-like ground colors, its unique painterly style, wherein flowers were stylized in bouquets, and birds and charming figures set within pastoral views. Emblems and devices were contrived around these painted views to give a floating and light effect. The whole impression was one of delicate, sensuous frivolity, so in keeping with the fashionable Rococo fête galante. The work of François Boucher became an early and predominant inspirational source. On the top middle, you will see that in the National Gallery's collection, there is in monochrome or en camo, an object that which is used to set off Far Eastern narratives or Boucher-style designs of figures such as cupids and shepherdesses. By 1752, Louis's favorite mistress, Madame de Pompadour, who also had a financial interest in the factory, gave Vincennes continuous, rigorous, and enthusiastic support, as did members of the French court. The fine, very white soft paste porcelain, with now more extensive and brilliant ground colors, bleu royal, sky or bleu celeste, and lapis lazuli, apple green and pink. By 1753, Vincennes was the unsurpassed leader of European porcelain production. In 1753, it had become the Manufacture Royale de Porcelain. At this date, it had surpassed Meissen in its reach and fashionability, and the formal royal designation hoped to cement for Louis a porcelain monopoly. By 1756, Vincent had relocated to the Château de Sèvres on the outskirts of Paris, and its name changed to reflect the new location. Although early 18th century porcelain factories initially produced tea bowls for the consumption of fashionable and expensive tea, coffee, and chocolate, Sèvres soft-paste porcelain distinguished itself not only in terms of ground color and ornament, but also through the innovation of its forms. New ceramic objects were devised for every possible eventuality of refined life, from specialty cups and saucers, and from the 1750s with the introduction of the cup handle, and modeled with specific shapes relative to appropriate drinks, either hot or cold, and to different kinds of privileged consumers. After Madame de Pompadour's death in 1764, the style began to develop away from the curvilinear and light rococo towards a more academic neoclassical one. By Louis XVI and Maria Antoinette's reign, Sèvres had begun to produce hard-paste porcelain thanks to the discovery of kaolin-type rock in the Limousin region in the late 1760s. As we will learn shortly, this period was to coincide with Josiah Wedgwood's early years of innovation. And so at this point, we turn to England. What were the demands on producers and the desires of consumers here relative to porcelain and to non-porcelain wares in the 18th century? This painting of a family enjoying the drinking of tea tells us a good deal of polite society in the 1720s. The teapot, tea caddy, sugar caster, and pail are not of porcelain, but of silver. Indeed, the National Gallery, which has a very fine silver and ivory example in their collection from this period, which you see on the top right, made by the London silversmith Simon Panton II around 1732. The porcelain and the tea is consumed with and in Chinese export hard-paste porcelain, mass-produced in the city of Jingdezhan, and this cup and saucer on the bottom right in the Viennese collection is one of several hundred identical cups and saucers salvaged from a shipwreck dating to approximately 1725. In earthenware, tin glaze of the late 17th century had a direct connection with Dutch Delft through trade influences and a royal connection. Its production was a natural evolution, William III and Mary II becoming its obvious ambassadors from Holland. The English variation known as Delft ware. Naive lead-glazed slipware, which you see on the right, was produced regionally across a number of English counties and provided the middling sort of consumer with a product that, while not approximating porcelain, still had a vernacular, useful, and decorative charm. Not a product that would sustain an increasingly knowing and economically comfortable English 18th century gentility. Salt glazed ware after 1750 signaled a new threshold of middle class production and consumption. The inclusion of salt in the kiln to earthenware bodies created a non-porous film that allowed for increased hygienic and aesthetic use for every day. Calcination of the salt in the kiln at a relatively high temperature meant no need for a glaze or glossed extra firing. Inclusions of Cornish clay and of white stone moved these products closer, if only somewhat, to the feel of porcelain. The figure most closely associated with the move away from salt glaze production towards increased technical and market success of a future cream-coloured earthenware in the 1740s and 50s was the potter Thomas Wealden, producing white salt glazed stoneware along with red glazed earthenware, and also in the buff and brown, and of a solid earthenware agate ware. Although Wealden had improved upon earlier earthenware and stoneware products, shapes and decoration were very much in a traditional style, utilizing colored glazes, underglaze slips, and simple relief ornamentation employed by most North Staffordshire potters by the mid-18th century. As Wealden developed his various methods and decorative techniques, he encouraged the apprenticeship of other young potters. Among these were the figures Josiah Spode, William Greatbatch, and Josiah Wedgwood. By the end of the 1750s, quality salt glazed stoneware produced by good potters such as Wealden was very reasonably priced, so much so that its production was becoming uneconomical for most Staffordshire potworks. Prices were reduced so low that the potters could not afford to experiment further and to justify more expense. But the consumer began to tire of it, with no improvement in regard to elegance of form, and though its price continuously lowered, there was little left, as the historian Adrian Forty noted, quote, to give a little spirit to the business. And so it was at the age of 24 in 1754 that Josiah Wedgwood entered into partnership with his mentor, Thomas Wealden, remaining with him for 5 years, during which time Wedgwood experimented with and developed ceramic body variations and a number of different lead glazes. So successful was this partnership in developing a superior, pale, cream earthenware that by 1759, Wedgwood felt sufficiently ready to embark on production on his own. He left Wealden's potworks to set up for himself, securing sufficient capital to rent the Ivy House and potworks in Burslem from his uncles, Wedgwood coming from an extended pottery family, and to become completely independent. His understanding that the public was growing tired of salt glazed and tortoiseshell ware encouraged him to move earthenware production into a new realm. In this early independent period, earthenware was concurrently developed by William Greatbatch, who supplied wares to Wedgwood and with which he was in loose partnership. Greatbatch wares were distinguished by moulding in the fashionable mid-18th century taste, with shapes and textures imitating cauliflowers, pineapples, melons, but employing a green glaze developed by Wedgwood. Although Wedgwood was improving both the body and glazes, he realized that the earthenware market would soon demand more elegant wares, principally to rival European and English porcelains. To achieve this, he needed larger premises for experimentation and production. By 1766, his dream of establishing himself as a larger factory owner was realized, and he purchased a 350-acre estate near Hanley in Staffordshire for £3,000, designed his own factory, and set about the production of his earthenware with prudent and rational forethought. English porcelain factories, to which Wedgwood's entire cream-coloured earthenware modus operandi was levelled, had been attempting their own French-style soft-paste bodies, in materiality if not immediately in aesthetics. First, Chelsea, just outside of London, from the mid-1740s, under the entrepreneurial directorship of Nicholas Sprimont, a Huguenot silversmith, and then Chelsea's own imitator, the Bow Factory, located to the east of the city of London, used lead, glass frit, and bone ash, respectively, to approximate at the least the creaminess and translucency of the early French porcelain factories. Into the 1760s, it was these factories, now with the addition of Worcester and Derby factories, that prevailed at the upper middle-class British consumer market, as you can see here in this slide, from both the Chelsea example on the left and the later Worcester on the right, that ornament and ground colour development was more than a little influenced by Sèvres and by Far East Asian examples. Spurred on by the inconsistencies and derivative nature of English porcelain production, Wedgwood's intention never was to produce porcelain, but instead to manufacture a viable, elegant, standardized, and wholly civilized porcelain alternative for a both domestic and genteel market. And by the late 1760s, he became entrenched. To diversify into porcelain would have been to stretch the focus of his production and market. He had no appetite for this kind of competition. He desired to excel in a narrower field and to fuel consumer desire for it. Thus, Wedgwood's intention was to continue the production of cream-coloured earthenware, or creamware as it became known, and crucially also to refine the body and the form, to respond to the change in taste which was moving away from the Rococo towards neoclassicism. By 1765, Wedgwood successfully had produced a light, thin, strong, cream-coloured ware of a buttery hue with a thin, brilliant lead glaze, and had secured a commission from Queen Charlotte for a creamware dessert service. From 1766, he naturally marketed his creamware as Queensware. The genius of Wedgwood's Queensware production was manifold. First, he was able to produce a non-porcelain, both useful and decorative ware, in both quantity and of quality. This was possible through the introduction of division of labour within his factory, wherein workers excelled at a finite number of tasks, for example, throwing or sprigging, thereby ensuring excellence in one or a few areas. Secondly, as this division of labour allowed for efficient production within the factory, the consumer thus benefited in terms of price. Although Wedgwood priced his wares with a comfortable middle-class market in mind, his creamware nonetheless still was reasonable, especially relative to the expensive domestic and European porcelains available to buyers in Britain. They were elegant enough to uphold a sense of domestic civility without the ostentation element of porcelains. Affordable among the professional and entrepreneurial middle classes, but acceptable to the upper classes for everyday use. Thirdly, Wedgwood offered consumers a choice of either hand painted or transfer printed wares. Hand enamelling was done in London, first in Chelsea in 1769, and then at Portland House on Greek Street in Soho by 1774. Transfer printing was sent to Liverpool after 1763 to be decorated by the printing innovators Sadler and Green. These choices could be made either in his London shop or through catalogue selection. In 1774, he published his first catalogue, a catalogue of the different articles of queensware, which may be had either plain, gilt, or embellished with enamel paintings. This eventually would have 6 editions with translations into French, German, and Dutch. Wedgwood recognized the convenience to the consumer by offering catalogue selection of standardized output and therefore of breadth of choice and expediency. The increase in shapes with both of painted and printed patterns meant that his factory continuously needed development and industrial innovation in order to process orders efficiently. This became especially important as increased interest in his creamware translated into increased scales of production. Wedgwood ensured a satisfied consumer base at different economic levels, from the middle classes who appreciated a sophisticated alternative to salt glazed stoneware, to wealthy and aristocratic circles who were enthralled with the novelty and the grace of this porcelain substitute. After 1770, Wedgwood began impressing his creamware, queensware, with a Wedgwood mark. This additional means of advertising his successful product ensured a varied patronage. In 1774, Empress Catherine II of Russia ordered an extensive porcelain dessert service from Sèvres in the neoclassical taste, ordering it to the factory's disappointment in the soft paste bleu celeste ground color, demanding a neoclassical aesthetic but in a rococo ground color. The commission was produced at crippling expense because of the need to make it in soft paste porcelain. That, of course, is another story. But for our purposes, what is significant is that in the same year, that year of Wedgwood's first catalogue publication, Catherine requested a dessert service in queensware known as the Frog Service, ordering over 1,000 pieces of enameled creamware in hand-painted sepia decoration, displaying almost as many British landscape views. The combination of this commission, along with the success of his queensware tableware, all but put an end to salt glazed stoneware consumption in England and proved how rigorously Wedgwood could compete within the highest markets, even against Sèvres. The 1770s was marked by the emerging neoclassical taste, keenly embraced by Wedgwood. His academic interest in the antique as both a collector and a designer increasingly became evident in his refined and elegant shapes and decorative motifs for his creamware. The original popular organic creamware shapes were replaced, and Wedgwood's tableware became synonymous with simple shapes and flat surfaces. These characteristics made it easier to decorate in the neoclassical manner. The molded feather edge and shell borders of the 1760s gave way to flat, or slightly concave plate rims, and hollowware such as teapots and sugar boxes imitated the classical lines of silver shapes of the period. Decoration was restrained and elegant, floral motifs, abstract patterns with inspiration from excavated antique Greek and Roman vases. Such was Wedgwood's intrigue with the excavated vessels extracted from archaeological sites in Italy. He was inspired to produce variegated ware in the antique style, whereby creamware vessels were treated with oxide colors and sponge techniques in such a way as to resemble marble, granite, and porphyry. A crucial element of Wedgwood's commercial success, both at home and abroad, was his long association with his business partner, Thomas Bentley. Bentley had apprenticed to a Liverpool cloth merchant, afterwards setting himself up there as an active and prominent citizen when his trading house became Wedgwood's Liverpool agent in the mid-1760s. The two men found themselves alike in many respects. They both held liberal intellectual ideals, both were intrigued by classical discoveries on the continent, and both were interested in the possibilities of creative commerce. By 1769, they had formed a partnership whereby Wedgwood's technical innovations and commercial drive matched perfectly with Bentley's business acumen and marketing vision. His sophisticated understanding of markets and fashion had a great effect on Wedgwood's production, helping to transform the already successful potter now into a leader of the highest taste. The move towards a neoclassical style was one that came about in part from careful associations with members of the aristocracy who had journeyed to the continent on the Grand Tour. As mentioned at the start of this lecture, the introduction of encaustic and jasper wares were two such sophisticated products under the Wedgwood and Bentley partnership. Jasperware, which survives as Wedgwood's most recognized project, initially began as stoneware experimentation with the view to approximating antique cameos, gems, medallions, and plaques. His jasper was an entirely new invention, which in its unglazed form appeared to have a texture to that of marble. He began experimenting with this new stoneware in 1771, but it took him until 1774 and 10,000 trials before he was satisfied that he had developed an excellent product, which could then take a number of different colored stains. The most popular color was blue, but other colors included green, lilac, yellow, brown, black, and white. The experimentation and production of jasper was an expensive undertaking. Wedgwood's main challenge with the production was the perfecting of the fire. It was crucial with this ware that vitrification be at a point where porosity was reduced to a minimum for maximum unglazed impact. Quality control was imperative. The appeal of jasperware was its smooth, perfectly formed surface. It demanded virtual perfection in the casting and molding processes. Important objects of significance were made of basalt and jasperware, and here we see on the right an example in the National Gallery's collection. In 1787, Wedgwood began producing jasperware tokens with a protest symbol showing an enslaved man in chains. These medallions were distributed for free as one tool in the long campaign for British Parliament to abolish the slave trade. The medallion design, based on the seal of the Abolition Society and sculpted by his best modeler, William Hackwood, spread awareness of his signature product to a wealthy audience while contributing to a cause to which he passionately supported. A European consumer base, even by the 1770s, was becoming increasingly intrigued with English creamware imports. As with the new American market, late 18th century Europeans welcomed the availability of reasonably priced, non-porcelain yet highly elegant wares for their tables. The Treaties of Commerce and Navigation of 1786 and 1787, setting a simple 12% rate of duty on the value of imports from France to Britain and vice versa, crucially facilitated the importation of ware from Wedgwood into Europe. France was Europe's major importer of English creamware. It is not surprising that it was the first to develop its own cream-coloured earthenware. By the early 19th century, Wedgwood-type creamware, known as faïence fine or fine earthenware, eventually would eclipse all other European tin-glazed ware. Though French creamware clearly is distinct from English ware, the Wedgwood model nonetheless was very important to French artistic development. It was coloured in various shades of black, white, and red, or marbled with metallic oxides in imitation of Wedgwood's variegated wares. Outside of France, a number of commercial industries emerged with some strength in the forest regions of Bohemia, in Prague, and in Silesia by the late 1780s. And as we see here, Russia was producing a very fine creamware product. The Sèvres Factory in St. Petersburg in 1810, fairly copying an early Wedgwood design of the 1770s. And these objects also held in the National Gallery's collection. The excellence of a developed hard-paste porcelain or bone china in England by the 1830s became the preoccupation for Wedgwood and most 19th century ceramic manufacturers. The irony should not be lost on us. But the legacy of cream-coloured earthenware reappears in the 20th century. For some context, British ceramic manufacturers, though industrialized and more mechanized from the advances of the 19th century, still found themselves perched precariously between two worlds, between the wars. Although there was a certain sophistication of production after World War I, that meant that manufacturers did have the capability for change. Critics of interwar design noted a preoccupation with the science of output to the detriment of aesthetic progression. There was a very real economic fear that if production shifted too quickly and too extremely towards a European modern sensibility, the potteries would lose their mainstay middle-class consumers. And Wedgwood was not different from its competitors in this regard. Against a background of ancient markets, a good design debate ensued within the industry with those who believed that Britain needed to shake off its nostalgia and clinging traditionalism, that manufacturers were too concerned with either the Englishness of design or of a pastiche of derivative Art Deco ornament. Encouraged by the government-supported Design and Industries Association, which promoted an art and industry approach, by the 1930s, Wedgwood focused on producing high-quality products in styles and forms that would win them over as being distinctly British, while pointing to European modernist approaches. In 1938, a new factory in Barlston, south of Stoke-on-Trent, in the international style architectural idiom, underlined this commitment. British design reformers and manufacturers such as Wedgwood, wishing to move consumption towards an acceptance of modern form and decoration, were rare in the face of reluctant critics and consumers, unsure of how the nostalgia of Britain's traditions past might not be lost. Another key figure associated with progressive Wedgwood design in the 1930s, but with a nod to the factory's 18th century legacy, was the designer Eric Revilius, who incorporated a three-color lithographic process, printing traditionally inspired British scenes and pastimes, yet with a stylized, restrained, and distinctly modern character. And I have examples all here from the National Gallery's collection. My final slide takes us to after World War II. And optimism was channeled and encouraged through the exuberant 1951 Festival of Britain, rising from the still evident destruction in London to promote new design and innovative technology for hopeful post-war British consumers. Many new designs predicated upon the innovative spirit of past centuries. And as it had over the previous almost 200 years, Wedgwood exhibited its new production that touched upon tradition and championed modernity. And as we see here, to finish our lecture, with examples in cream-coloured earthenware. Thank you very much, and that concludes this morning's lecture.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for such an interesting and informative lecture. You've covered a lot of ground and touched actually on a number of design and manufacturing aspects that will be addressed by other speakers in our later presentations. So thank you so much. And thank you to all of you for joining us for this talk. Our next presentation will be a discussion on trade and exchange with Sarah Peeram, Dr. Maya Priyadarshini, and Dr. Maria Quirk. We hope you'll enjoy it. Thank you.